Hi everyone, welcome to Intro to Labor Studies for the week of April 20th. We're going to be talking about the Green New Deal this week. This is the last lecture that I'm going to record with new content. Next week I will post a video that has some observations that tie the course together, some of the themes that we've been talking about all semester, and some of the takeaways that I hope that you have. But this will be the last kind of formal lecture week. So a couple of announcements. Your service learning project is due on the end of next week, so Friday, May 1st. And as a reminder, all of the information about what you need to do for the reflection is posted on Blackboard. You've also had it emailed to you at least twice now, I believe. But please do let me know if you have any questions. Let's see, I mentioned that we would be doing a wrap-up lecture next week. And then I'll also post and or record some review materials for the final exam. As I mentioned at the beginning of the semester, what we'll do for the final exam is it'll just be a series of short answer questions, and I will give you more choices than what's required to answer. So I might give you like 7 options and you choose 5 of them, something along those lines. So keep that in mind, and I will, post some review stuff and some ways for you to prepare next week. As usual, I have office hours Wednesday and Friday from 2 to 4, and I'll do that this week, next week, and during finals week. I have decided you all should have received an email with the number of classes you missed before spring break and then any discussion board posts that you were missing. And I've decided to let you make up past discussion board posts without penalty, just because I know that everything has been so discombobulated since spring break, since we've been online. So I want to give folks a chance to make that work up without having any kind of penalty. In order for me to have time to kind of like compile and synthesize everything, in order to get credit, you do need to finish that by Tuesday of finals week, and that's May 5th. And then you'll also notice if you're in the Grade Center on Blackboard that I've set it up so that as you are turning in your final assignments and I'm grading them, there's weighted columns where you can start to see what your final grade will look like. And please do remember that you have the option to take the course pass no credit this semester, and you can decide that before or after you get your final grade. So I think that is it in terms of okay, so what is the Green New Deal? We are going to start with this video from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, in which she describes her vision for the bill. She's of course the co-sponsor along with Senator Ed Markey from Massachusetts. So let me go ahead and play this. It's about 7 minutes long.
The bullet train from New York to DC. It always brings me back to when I first started making this commute. In 2019, I was a freshman in the most diverse Congress in history. Up to that point, it was a critical time. I'll never forget the children in our community. They were so inspired to see this new class of politicians who reflected them, navigating the halls of power. It's often said, you can't be what you can't see. And for the first time, they saw themselves. I think there was something similar with the Green New Deal. We knew that we needed to save the planet and that we had all the technology to do it, but people were scared. They said it was too big, too fast, not practical. I think that's because they just couldn't picture it yet. Anyways, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start with how we got here. 1977, New York. A senior scientist named James Black made a presentation about how burning fossil fuels could eventually lead to global temperatures rising 4 or 5 degrees Fahrenheit. Within 2 years, one of the world's biggest supertankers was outfitted with a state-of-the-art lab to measure CO2 in the ocean, gathering more data about global warming. Guess who was doing all of this research? ExxonMobil, the oil and gas company. Oh yeah, Exxon knew this whole time, as did our politicians. 10 years later, James Hansen, NASA's top climate scientist, told Congress he was 99% certain that global warming was happening and caused by humans. That was 1988, the year before I was even born. So did Exxon listen to the science, including their own? Did they change business models, invest in renewables? No, the opposite. They knew and they doubled down. They and others spent millions setting up a network of lobby groups and think tanks to create doubt and denial about climate change. It was an effort designed to attack and dispute the very kind of science they themselves had been doing. And it worked. Politicians went to bat for fossil fuels, and these massive corporations kept digging and mining, drilling and fracking like there was no tomorrow. America became the biggest producer and consumer of oil in the world. Fossil fuel companies made hundreds of billions, while the public paid the lion's share to clean up their disasters. We lost a generation of time we'll never get back. Entire species will never get back. Natural wonders gone forever. And in 2017, Hurricane Maria destroyed the place where my family was from, Puerto Rico. It was like a climate bomb. It took as many American lives as 9/11. And in the next year, when I was elected to Congress, the world's leading climate scientists declared another emergency. They told us that we had 12 years left to cut our emissions in half, or hundreds of millions of people would be more likely to face food and water shortages, poverty, and death. 12 years to change everything. How we got around, how we fed ourselves, how we made our stuff, how we lived and worked, everything. The only way to do it was to transform our economy, which we already knew was broken, since the vast majority of wealth was going to just a small handful of people, and most folks were falling further and further behind. It was a true turning point. Lots of people gave up. They said we were doomed. But some of us remembered that as a nation, we'd been in peril before. The Great Depression, World War II. We knew from our history how to pull together to overcome impossible odds. And at the very least, we owed it to our children to try. The wave began when Democrats took back the House in 2018, and then the Senate and the White House in 2020, and launched the decade of the Green New Deal, a flurry of legislation that kicked off our social and ecological transformation to save the planet. It was the kind of swing for the fence ambition we needed. Finally, we were entertaining solutions on the scale of the crises we faced without leaving anyone behind. That included Medicare for All, the most popular social program in American history. We also introduced the Federal Jobs Guarantee, a public option including dignified living wages for work. Funnily enough, the biggest problem in those early years was a labor shortage. We were building a national smart grid, retrofitting every building in America, putting trains like this one all across the country. We needed more workers. That group of kids from my neighborhood were right in the middle of it all, especially this one girl, Ileana. Her first job out of college was with AmeriCorps Climate, restoring wetlands and bayous in coastal Louisiana. Most of her friends were in her union, including some oil workers in transition. They took apart old pipelines and got to work planting mangroves with the same salary and benefits. Of course, when it came to healing the land, we had huge gaps in our knowledge. Luckily, Indigenous communities offered generational expertise to help guide the way. Ileana got restless, tried her hand as a solar plant engineer for a while, but eventually made her career in raising the next generation as part of the Universal Child Care Initiative. As it turns out, caring for others is valuable, low-carbon work, and we started paying real money to folks like teachers, domestic workers, and home health aides. Those were years of massive change, and not all of it was good. When Hurricane Sheldon hit southern Florida, parts of Miami went underwater for the last time. But as we battled the floods, fires, and droughts, we knew how lucky we were to have started acting when we did. And we didn't just change the infrastructure, we changed how we did things. We became a society that was not only modern and wealthy, but dignified and humane too. By committing to universal rights like healthcare and meaningful work for all, we stop being so scared of the future. We stop being scared of each other, and we found our shared purpose. Ileana heard the call too, and in 2028 she ran for office in the first cycle of publicly funded election campaigns, and now she occupies the seat that I once held. I couldn't be more proud of her, a true child of the Green New Deal. When I think back to my first term in Congress, riding that old school Amtrak in 2019, all of this was still ahead of us. And the first big step was just closing our eyes and imagining it. We can be whatever we have the courage to see.
Okay, so obviously that's a pretty rosy picture, and this is AOC basically selling her vision to the rest of us and saying this is what we want to see, this is what's possible. But I just want to pull out a few of the things that she mentioned as key components of the Green New Deal. So the first important thing to know is that this is actually a non-binding resolution, which means that when it's passed, it's basically advisory in nature. So it doesn't automatically put any of the systems into place. It just says this is a roadmap for what we want our legislature to work on in the next 10 years. That has caused a lot of controversy on both sides. A lot of people have said, if you're going to introduce something like this, it should be, 1,000 pages and it should detail every single thing. But that's not what the bill is. It's basically just, here's a list of suggestions of what we want to accomplish, and we'll take each of those and sort of fight out the details later. Another important, the major piece is that we know that we have to reduce our emissions to net zero by 2050. And the Green New Deal says we want this to happen in the next 10 years from when it passes. So we know that we need to pass things more quickly, and we'll talk about some of the reason for that in a second. But this is an urgent project. This isn't what most of the previous iterations of a Green New Deal have been, and there have been versions of this in the works and in proposals for a few decades now, actually. But this version says, no, we've put this off way too long, and so this is something that we have to do immediately. Another piece of it is making sure that 100% of the emissions of the power demand is done through clean, renewable energy with zero emissions, stop using fossil fuels entirely, and slowly transition away from nuclear energy, but not that slowly. Making sure that we build infrastructure for mass transportation is a huge piece of this. So lots and lots of jobs, as she said, replacing things like, she mentions this old school Amtrak as opposed to she's on the light rail, she's on the bullet train between New York and DC. So energy efficient transportation, electric vehicles, and a huge network of charging stations. Making sure also that our buildings, our everyday buildings, our homes, our businesses, the physical buildings themselves are also energy efficient. Reducing pollution, working with farmers to reduce the total amount of emissions that come from agriculture, and moving to smaller family farms from big business agriculture. Making sure that everyone has a guaranteed job that has a living wage, benefits, and retirement package. Making sure that all Americans have clean water. Increasing manufacturing within the US and making sure that that manufacturing is energy efficient. And those are the basic pieces of the Green New Deal. So we're going to go into some more detail about some of those things and some of the issues. But what I really want to do is spend some time thinking about how labor as a whole has responded to the Green New Deal. It's been a mess. is the short version. So there is no consistent response from labor, but we've talked about the AFL-CIO being this umbrella organization that represents a lot of the major players in the labor movement. And shortly after, within weeks of the Green New Deal being released last spring, just over a year ago, the AFL-CIO sent a letter to Representative Ocasio-Cortez, and I've posted it here, so the next two slides. So the first one is basically like, we agree with you in principle. We know that climate change is a problem. We know that we need to invest in new technologies that are less detrimental to the climate. We know that the increase in natural gas production has lowered emissions in the power sector and provided a new source of construction and manufacturing jobs. So right away, there's a key difference in saying, wait, hold on, we're not ready to go away from natural gas yet. We must invest in energy efficiency in the industrial and commercial sectors, retrofits and upgrades to our infrastructure. Everything has to be paired with strong labor and procurement standards to grow family-sustaining middle-class union jobs. Okay, aside from that piece about natural gas, pretty much in agreement, right? The labor movement has been working on these issues for decades, so a little bit snarky. A lot of this letter seems to be, why didn't you invite us to the table to talk about it? And in fact, President Trumka, yeah, his name is actually Trumpka, which is odd. But so President Trumpka actually says, like, we don't understand why, if this is such a pro-labor bill, we weren't invited to the table. Like, nobody even talked to us about this. And so we've been blindsided. It's embarrassing for us, is sort of the subtext of this letter, right? So now come the more specific pieces. The Green New Deal resolution is far too short on specific solutions, which we just talked about. That is this very like 14 pages rather than 1,000 or 2,000 pages. It speaks to the jobs of our members and the critical sectors of our economy, not rooted in an engineering-based approach, makes promises that are not achievable or realistic. Okay, so these are very common criticisms that are leveled at the Green New Deal. Let's keep going. And then we have this piece at the top here. We will not accept proposals that could cause immediate harm to millions of our members and their families. We will not stand by and allow threats to our members' jobs and their families' standard of living go unanswered. And then they say, we want to keep talking to you, but we are specialists. We have a lot to contribute to this conversation, but please invite us in. And then, so this is the Energy Committee of the AFL-CIO. So if we look at who is represented on that committee down here, we see the mine workers, electrical workers, laborers, United Association, which is like plumbers and pipe fitters, steel workers, boiler makers, iron workers, utility workers, operating engineers, and then the building trades. So essentially all of these fall under the umbrella of what we call the trades. And this is illustrative of a very long divide in the labor movement. This is nothing new, but climate change brings this to the fore in a way that is even more stark and even more difficult to kind of reconcile. And I've been in rooms with people in the labor movement on either side of this issue, essentially screaming at each other. It's not pretty. So on the one hand, you have a set of people who are saying, if you go ahead with this plan, and I think it's really easy to criticize a letter like this. And certainly, you know, I'm not good at hiding my own opinions, right? You're all welcome to have your own opinions. But when you think about this line at the top, immediate harm to millions of our members and their families, it's really difficult to imagine how the kind of transition that Representative Ocasio-Cortez is saying that we desperately need, and we do, right, wouldn't pull millions of people out of jobs that are union jobs that they've been trained to do, that they know how to do, they have safety equipment for, they have training in. How are you going to uproot all of those people from their jobs, right? And move them into a new industry that they don't really know anything about. You know, one of the critiques from the right of how the left talks about this is that they're so out of touch with the average working person that you're not going to take an average mine worker and say, well, just take some coding classes and you'll be able to, you know, learn a new set of skills for a new job immediately. That's just not realistic. That's not how people operate. And when you have industries also that are heavily unionized, so that's the other concern, right? All of the trades, if you're talking about private sector people in unions, they're almost all in the trades, the building trades, right? So if you're talking about creating millions of new jobs in new industries that we haven't thought of before, and eliminating entire industries, right? So you're eliminating the industry that does mining. You're eliminating certain industry, you know, like the iron workers, the utility workers, the way that a lot of these people know how to do business. You're taking those jobs away and you're replacing them with jobs without a guarantee that they're going to be in a union. So now the unions have to go and invest a bunch of money and time and staff into reorganizing these new industries. And without a guarantee, real guarantee of pensions, benefits, healthcare plans that include families, spouses, and dependents, and children, all of the benefits that these unions have fought for would be wiped out. So when you start to think about it from that perspective, you can kind of start to understand where a letter like this comes from, right? Whether you agree with it or not is a separate issue, but you can start to understand some of the real fear and insecurity about the future that's behind it, and two, the feeling that it's not fair that this is something that impacts us dramatically, and we're not even invited to the table to talk about it and to plan it. Okay, let's keep moving. So the way that we describe the central concern of most folks on both sides of this question in the labor movement is this idea of just transition. Just transition is exactly what it sounds like. So if you are someone whose industry is going to be impacted by climate change and by the solutions to climate change, then you should have the right to a new job that comes with at least the same salary. You shouldn't be giving up your seniority or your salary, the raises that you've had. You know, if you've been working a job for 20 years as an electrical worker and you're suddenly converting to a different job, are you going to be starting at the bottom of that pay scale because you've just entered into that job? There has to be some kind of guarantee that you're going to be able to maintain the lifestyle that you have earned up until now without sacrificing anything in terms of benefits, in terms of, you know, let's say that you're a miner in West Virginia. Your home is West Virginia. Your family is there. Generations of your people are there. So how are we going to make sure realistically that those folks don't have to completely uproot and relocate en masse? There are always going to be some people who do want to follow the jobs and the money, but we shouldn't have like mass forcing of people to migrate because of this. And of course, without also losing access to the right to be in a union. Okay, so thinking some more about the other side of the piece. So there are also a lot of unions and organizations that have responded completely positively and said, this is amazing, this is exactly what we need. there's a little moment in the video where AOC says something about care work being green jobs because they really don't have as much of an environmental impact, and they're also some of the lowest paid work. So nursing, maybe not so much nursing is more of a middle class job, but teaching, personal care attendants, elder care, child care. And these jobs are often underpaid, disrespected, and that in her vision of the future under the Green New Deal, that work that is carbon neutral for the most part is valued and paid for really by society. So we have a lot of unions that have actually fully endorsed the Green New Deal. The Maine AFL-CIO was a major one. They passed a version in Maine that is a little bit watered down, but it was huge that they did have the AFL-CIO on board. SEIU 509 is one of the largest union locals, and SEIU 32BJ also, and they both operate here in Massachusetts. 509 is entirely in Massachusetts, I believe. 32BJ is up and down kind of the Atlantic seaboard. And I should add 509 represents a lot of care workers and a lot of public sector workers who do kind of like governmental agency and social work. 32BJ represents a lot of janitors and cleaners. The Los Angeles city version of their AFL-CIO has endorsed AFT Oregon and the Association of Flight Attendants, which is an interesting one that we're going to come back to in a second. Some of the other things that unions are doing is building climate justice caucuses, which is an unofficial group of members that want to see the local take on an issue or go in a different direction, or maybe share some characteristics. So there are lavender caucuses for LGBTQ, there are Asian and Pacific Islander caucuses, Black and African American caucuses, all different ones. So there are a lot of climate justice caucuses that are starting to form. And a lot of times what they will try to do is go to convention and pass a resolution saying that the union is on board and would support a resolution or the Green New Deal, a piece of law, or a particular candidate. Remember that one of the ways that unions build power is by endorsing candidates. So if they're able to say, we want part of the platform for how we decide who to endorse and who not to endorse to be based on their attitude towards environmental issues. That would be an example. And maybe also advocate for things like there was going to be a climate strike on April 22nd. There are rolling climate strikes, of course, started by students and Greta Thunberg, but trying to expand that to become worker strikes as well, and having people walk off the job in order to demand government action on climate change. And here we go. I've included a link here, and I will post the slides as well separately so that you can copy paste of a really nice summary that sort of says, like, here's where the major players are. It goes into a little bit more detail about some of the things that I've just named. There are a couple of other organizations that I want to mention who are working to varying degrees on a just transition and climate change. So one of them has been around for quite a while. It's called the Blue-Green Alliance. SEIU, the Steelworkers, UA, which again is the plumbers and pipe fitters, the utility workers, AFT, which is the American Federation of Teachers. So there are some major international unions that are part of it, along with some environmental organizations like the Sierra Club and the National Wildlife Fund, and there are a few others as well. So these are some of the statistics, and you can Google Blue-Green Alliance and go to their website and sort of look at what their version. It's a little bit more moderate than some of the other labor organizations that are out there, but it does have a very long history of advocating, and they have a number of examples of, like, this is a sector where we were able to achieve a just transition. So some of the statistics that they cite: There are 1.9 million Americans currently employed in the energy efficiency sector, so who are currently already employed in just transition in jobs that are working towards climate change. Housing consumes over 20% of our energy, but there are solutions like community benefit agreements, retrofits, and economic development. If you follow Lowell City politics, you know that we have, largely thanks to the efforts of our 350.org chapter, an agreement passed very recently by the city council that a much higher threshold of our energy would come from renewables citywide than in the past, and much higher than the minimum threshold required by the state. So things like that. And we've seen the statistic before that more than 11% of America's workers are union members, but the utility industries are overrepresented, 21% in the utilities. So it's, you know, the idea being this impacts our members more deeply than a lot of others. And then we can see a proper transition. So they give the example of a facility in Ohio in '95, and the UWUA local was able to get grants from the Department of Labor in order to retrain and rehire those employees into roughly equivalent jobs. And then you can see their full kind of manifesto here. So as you can see, this isn't nearly as radical as the Green New Deal. Largely, they are saying we do have a lot of people who are already doing this work, and that is part of what we've been fighting for: more jobs, more good union jobs in the energy efficiency sector. And then also this idea that there are other kinds of things that we can be doing to move towards a transition to net zero emissions. And the subtext being maybe without completely upending everything. We can take more gradual steps. And oh, here we go. Here's another link that you can see, which I believe is where these statistics came from. Another important network is called Labor Network for Sustainability. This one is much more in line with the Green New Deal as written. And their I didn't put their website here, I'm sorry, but if you Google Labor Network for Sustainability, I think it's got the number 4 in it. And essentially, they're the ones who are pushing for things like climate strikes and for more radical caucuses to push international leadership to do more quickly. And then I mentioned the flight attendants being an interesting example. And the reason I think that the flight attendants are interesting is because if you read a lot about environmental statistics, you know that the frequency with which we fly and also ship goods is a major contributor to climate change and to emissions. So you might think that this is a sector that's going to be very conservative and say, we're afraid that once you start restricting things, we are going to suffer, and so we don't want to see these things. But they have a very charismatic president named Sarah Nelson, and this is the Association of Flight Attendants, AFA, and it's affiliated with the Communications Workers of America, CWA, so that's AFA, CWA. And Sarah Nelson has come out very strongly in favor of the Green New Deal. She's incredibly progressive, and Inside Labor Politics says that she is one of the 2 women in the running to be the next president of the National AFL-CIO. So rather than an administration that sends the letter that we looked at earlier, we potentially would have a woman who is really interested in shaking things up And I've given you the source for this quote at the bottom, but it's worth going back and reading that full article because she talks about the ways in which climate change has actually contributed to unsafe working conditions for flight attendants. And she focuses in this piece very specifically on the issue of turbulence and how much more common it's become since the weather has become more unstable, and the fact that that has become a huge issue for her workers and her union. So she starts out talking about turbulence as like an everyday impact for her workers. And she says, she kind of concludes with this quote that says, architects and proponents of the Green New Deal also need to address the history of the fair and just transition the resolution promises. Too many communities have heard those words only to see jobs disappear while the promise of retraining and new jobs never materializes. Workers are skeptical, and the opponents of meaningful action are taking advantage of that distrust. If we can't overcome suspicion that tackling climate change just means job loss, we'll never enlist workers or millions of others in jobs that rely on carbon-based fuels in the solution. Climate change is happening now. We need to get serious about it. Aspiring to achieve a green economy with good union jobs that leave no one behind is exactly the solution we need to fight climate change and provide opportunity for all Americans. So she's sort of threading the needle in some way. She's saying, like, I can understand where the AFL-CIO is coming from. She's not actually saying that, but she's sort of implying it. She's saying we've gotten burned by this in the past, and so there's a reason people don't necessarily trust what a group of legislators is saying. Um, so we need you to put something more concrete on the table in terms of how you're going to guarantee jobs and what that's actually going to mean in practice. And the only way that you're going to get that to happen is to have workers, the rank and file, behind you supporting politicians who are putting these forward. So she is incredibly supportive of the Green New Deal and of Representative Ocasio-Cortez, but she is saying, you know, I'm the president of a group of workers who actually do rely on high emissions for their livelihood, and there are ways around it, but we really have to seriously talk in specifics. So it'll be very interesting over the next few years to see who ends up moving into the presidency of the AFL-CIO, whether it's Sarah Nelson, the other front runner. One of the other front runners is Liz Shuler, who's the current Secretary Treasurer, also wonderful, but quite a bit less radical, maybe. I wouldn't call Sarah Nelson radical exactly, but a little bit more moderate and a little bit more graduated in her approach to a lot of things. So the other way that I'd like you to think about all of this is by thinking about who is most impacted by the climate crisis. So we often talk about my cat's butt. We often talk about workers in the trades who are directly working in industries like the natural gas industry, oil refineries, all of that. But we forget that the folks who are the ones who are going to be most impacted and who are suffering the most are also workers, right? So the folks in SEIU 509 who are in middle and working class government jobs and are maybe living in communities that are going to be highly impacted, those are union members too. So the other argument in labor is that we also have to take into consideration the fact that a lot of the folks we represent are going to lose their livelihoods and lose their homes if we don't take drastic action on climate change right now. And so why do we spend so much time talking about the mostly white male workforce historically that's working in the trades when all of these other folks are also going to be impacted. How do we weigh those two against one another? And how do we make decisions that really do look at the community and also maybe look at folks who also, right, aren't in unions, the other 89% of the Americans who don't have the luxury of being in a union. And so that's where this idea of environmental racism comes to play. And the idea of environmental racism essentially says that whatever kind of climate policies you have and whatever kind of government regulations you have, they're going to impact different communities differently. And oftentimes the communities that are going to be most drastically impacted are communities of color and indigenous communities. So some examples of this, and we've been talking about this, right, for the last month. This is exactly what we've been talking about in the fashion industry. So on a global scale, we know that as we are offshoring our manufacturing, we're also offshoring our pollution, partly because those governments where we have offshored have lower environmental regulation standards. And it also is a kind of luxury and privilege, right? We don't have those factories in our backyard polluting our water supply anymore. We used to. If you go along the Riverwalk in Lowell, there's a lot of interesting signage about kind of what it was like in the 19th century when the city was actually full of factories that were spewing out smoke, and also the textile industry, just like we looked at in Bangladesh, right? Putting dyes and pollutants into the water supply, like directly into the Merrimack River. So some just basic examples of what that looks like. The Flint water crisis is an obvious one. So this is, and I think I'm not going to go into a ton of detail. We talked about this in class, I think, earlier in the semester, but essentially, Michigan had a policy where if a community wasn't doing well financially, the government could appoint an emergency manager that would wipe out any labor contracts, any democratically appointed officials, and sort of replace them with their own crew who would come in and get the city back on track. Not coincidentally, all of the cities that have had emergency managers have been majority minority communities, so largely Black and Latino communities. And Flint was one of those, and the emergency manager, not democratically elected, replaced an elected official, made a decision to switch where the water was coming from in order to save money. And I think that I also gave the example of the fact that I lived 40 miles to the west in another city that was somewhat similar to Flint, slightly higher median income, but that city was not under emergency management, was able to replace all of their pipes. We had like the city dropping off free water filters and showing us how to use them and making sure that we were educated about what happened. Obviously, none of that happened with Flint, and now you have an entire generation of kids who are facing learning disabilities, hormonal problems, all kinds of issues because lead was in the water supply. There was also, as a side note, an interesting report that came out earlier this week saying that government at the highest levels, like the governor basically of Michigan, knew about the crisis long before, like evidence has come forward that he knew things before he has admitted that he knew things, and should have done something to stop it. Another example would be another one of the squad. So Rashida Tlaib has been fighting for a long time against pet coke factories. So this is like an industrial byproduct happening in her community that she represented in Detroit. Initially in the community where she was a state rep at the state level, and then once she was elected to become a US rep, still in her same community. So there are all kinds of health impacts that happen because of that, including increased asthma rates. And it's totally horrible and fascinating to see all of the ways in which the pandemic reinforces and reiterates all of these same issues. So a lot of the folks who are the communities that are most impacted are the ones where we do see a lot of environmental pollution, where we see a lot of historic policies that disenfranchise Black and Brown people. So, I mean, this is like all of it is sort of playing out in front of our eyes in the most horrifying way, really. You might remember Standing Rock a few years ago, so building and increasing a natural gas pipeline across Indigenous lands, and we saw months of Indigenous people and allies fighting back and occupying that land and being treated pretty horrifically. And then another one that you may not have heard of is an area called Oak Flat in Arizona. So there is a multinational company that is building a particular kind of copper mine. And the website here explains it better than I do, but essentially these are sacred lands for the Western Apache people. And they are also occupying that land and expect to essentially die there in order to protect their community. It also has a lot to do with water rights. I would love to have had my friend Duke, who is a member of the Western Apache, as a guest for the class, but alas, that won't happen. But some of his footage is actually used in this film, and it's going to screen this Thursday, the 23rd. You do have to RSVP. It's a Sierra Club production, but he contributed some of the footage for it. So that is definitely worth learning about. But another example of the ways in which environmentally harmful decisions have a disparate impact on our Indigenous peoples and our Black and Brown communities. And of course, the other piece that we should recognize is that a lot of the folks who are in these energy industries, like the mine workers in particular, have also been suffering for many years, right? So we talk about environmental racism, but we also want to mention that class is a really important part of that as well. So these photographs are by Earl Dotter, Dotter. And these are studies of mine workers that he did in West Virginia. And you know, the one on the right looks like it could be taken 100 years ago, but these are taken in the 80s and 90s, really. And those communities have been decimated by black lung. So inhaling cancerous particles. Again, you know, thinking about the current pandemic, these folks are also being hit really hard. So the photograph on the left is a group of miners who are at the doctor's office being tested for black lung. And he has some incredibly moving graphs. Another photograph of mine workers of his on the left. And then, of course, just to draw it back to the conversation that we've been having for the last month, and this is a repeat photograph from a couple weeks ago, but this is the destruction at Rana Plaza in Bangladesh. So, you know, let's see, to kind of tie all of that together, there isn't one dominant labor response to the Green New Deal and to the climate crisis, but hopefully this has helped you see some of the different responses and also some of the justification behind the responses, which when you start to think about the history of some of the communities that we're talking about, it starts to make sense why some communities and some unions are very much completely in favor of let's go ahead 120% on the Green New Deal, and some are saying we've suffered enough and we're not giving up what we've fought for and won. So to finish up with a few of the takeaways from the Naomi Klein reading, and I've given you kind of like her this is sort of the money quote here of her thesis in a nutshell. Climate change detonates the ideological scaffolding on which contemporary conservatism rests. So to backtrack for a second, Naomi Klein is most famous for her theory of shock doctrine, which I think that we've also talked about in class, that says when a crisis happens, a natural disaster or a war or a terrorist attack, a neoliberal government will use that as an opportunity to privatize and deregulate on steroids. So essentially, she has a lot of examples, but Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Maria, she talks about the ways in which governments have moved in and essentially privatized entire swaths of the society. Like New Orleans doesn't have public schools anymore. It's 100% charter after Hurricane Katrina. And that this is done very much on purpose, that this is a strategy to try to move the neoliberal ideology, the set of ideas that says we should have small government, we should privatize as much as possible and leave everything to the free market. She says this is a pattern that we're seeing over and over again. So a couple of pieces just to make sure, and then in the discussion boards this week, I'm going to ask you to discuss some of this. One, she says we cannot keep talking about the climate crisis in terms of individual solutions. So it doesn't make sense for us to say, I'm going to stop buying Tupperware or things with plastic packaging. That's important. However, the average everyday consumer doesn't have that kind of power. And without a full paradigm shift and a complete reimagining of the way that all of our government and economic policies work is not going to be enough to stop the impending doom, essentially, that we have brought upon ourselves. As I drink out of a plastic bottle, I'm sorry, it's reusable at least. Two, she says that having no caps on free trade and having a completely globalized supply chain that we looked at in Fashionopolis, so, sending things over to Bangladesh and then bringing them back over, and using shipping containers to kind of bring things all over the globe constantly back and forth. We have to stop what she calls our cult of shopping. We have to rein that in, and we have to shift to more local production. Third, she says we cannot continue to expect that our economy is going to keep growing at the same rate that it has since the 80s. Because if we cut emissions, we are going to have to start changing the expectations that we have for how our economy functions and how we all live. And then the fourth piece is really key and connects back to some of what we've been talking about already, which is that the restrictions have to be saved. The most severe restrictions and the harshest penalties have to be saved for the biggest offenders. So the major multinational corporations, the major contributors to pollution, like the United States and like China, right? That, the corporations who are doing that polluting are based in the US but operating out of other countries, and now we see this kind of domino effect where China is now exporting its emissions to other poorer countries. So she says, and this comes back to why AOC is saying that we in America need a 10-year plan rather than a 30-year plan. The countries who are the worst offenders need to completely change everything that they're doing in a much shorter time frame so that the countries who are lesser developed nations and have less access to resources can actually function so that their economy isn't completely decimated, basically a reversal of kind of global neo-colonial regimes. So countries in the global south African countries, Bangladesh, the stands, the former Soviet republics, the countries that are really struggling are still they're going to have a much harder time turning around their emissions. And so we need more drastic action by the worst offenders in order to cushion the worst impacts from the lesser developed nations, if that makes sense. Okay, so there's a lot here, and in the discussion board, I'm going to leave it pretty open this week. I'm going to ask you to just pick a piece of the Naomi Klein readings that you thought was interesting, or that you agree with, or that you disagree with, and just sort of talk about why, and ask you to respond to each other. So one post and one response to someone else, at least. And, if you all get in conversations with each other back and forth, that's all to the good. That's fantastic, because these are, super important issues for our times. And like I said last week, this is where I really miss having in-class discussions, because I think that you all have a lot of really interesting things to say about this, and I'm sorry that this is so one-sided and I don't get to hear all of your ideas, because I know that they're great. So I really am looking forward to reading those on the discussion boards. And I'll be in office hours, and I will talk to you all next week. Take care of yourselves.